I'm Ted Davey, your sponsor for this week's CACOR's presentation. I'm privileged to welcome on your behalf Dr. Jack Alpert from his home in Kansas. Over the years, Jack has worked to develop ways to explain the human predicament and what will be required for sustainable civilization. He got his PhD at Stanford in 1982 while at the Stanford Knowledge Integration Lab. 10 years later, as its director, the lab left Stanford to become a nonprofit research foundation. Jack has developed simplistic but effective methods to explain how population and growth must decrease to achieve a sustainable civilization, what we need to do to effect that change, and the associated operating rules. For his presentation today, Jack has spent many hours to create a 45-plus-minute video titled Imagining a Sustainable Civilization. All his supporting charts and photos, animated, result in a very big file, which were sent in 3 segments. Putting all this together technically to create, to transmit, receive, and to run as one presentation has been challenging, to say the least. So if we experience a short glitch, please be patient. The video is an engineering analysis of what is required to make a future civilization of only 10 million people sustained for 300 years, starting in 2100. This is only a thought experiment that teaches how many physical and social challenges there are to make a somewhat advanced civilization sustainable. If listeners want an engineer's view of how much trouble human civilization is in right now, or how we have to adapt to make the transition from today to this sustainable society, you are invited to visit Jack's website mentioned in the invitation. Jack is here with us online and will answer questions for about 45 minutes during our normal Q&A session after the video. As Art has talked about, I invite you to submit your questions on chat, and I will coordinate numbers to ask the question. I request you keep the preamble of your questions brief so we have more time to interact with Jack. Could we start the video, please?
My name is Jack Alpert. I am director of the Stanford Knowledge Integration Laboratory. I founded the lab in 1978 at Stanford University, and it is now a not-for-profit research foundation with no affiliation to the university. Skills research for 40 years focused on how people gather and integrate information to imagine future conditions. Recently, we have been using this process to imagine sustainable civilizations. That is, a civilization whose initial conditions and operating rules produce no injuries. The sustainable civilization we imagine begins in the year 2100. It derives no energy deliveries from fossil fuels, uranium fuels, fusion processes, or solar and wind machines that capture and condense diffuse energy. Instead, it is powered only by hydroelectric dams that existed at the time of the exercise. These dams silt in. Their continuous energy delivery lasts only 300 or 400 years. However, this may be long enough for our imagined modern technological civilization to bring fusion or some other energy source online. Without this technological breakthrough, our imagined civilization is not sustainable. Imagining this civilization has been in the works for over a decade. William Catton and David Pimentel, now deceased, were part of the original team. There are numerous others that made contributions. This talk is not about the extensive information and computations considered by the team. Some of this analysis was only back of the envelope, and some has become outdated. This talk is just my narrative of our process. It is designed to help you visualize a sustainable civilization. To start, let me show you a little movie I made, which provides a template for performing sustainability analysis on any existing or proposed civilization. Each of us has reasons for believing that our civilization is not sustainable. Too many people, declining energy deliveries, climate change, diminishing ore quality, species extinction, soil damage, falling water tables, increasing inequity, and rising conflict. However, if we designed a civilization with fewer of these trends, what analysis could confirm it would be sustainable? The analysis might be similar to the one used by NASA engineers when they designed the space station. Their model contained many variables. These variables describe the station's infrastructure, these the productive activities, these the populations, and these the supplies. These arrows describe the flow of astronaut labor to each activity, and these the flows of energy. The blue describes the flows of mass from each supply to each member of the population, each productive activity, and each infrastructure. The blue arrows are bidirectional, denoting the mass flows both in and out of each variable. For example, water is delivered to the astronauts from supplies and their waste get recycled back to these supplies. The engineers ran this simulation until it showed living on the space station would not injure the astronauts. If these engineers created such a simulation for spaceship Earth, the infrastructure might include houses, markets, hospitals, communication conduits, factories, farms, transport, schools, theaters, R&D labs, recycling, military forts, and wells, mines, refineries, and power plants. The last two are our civilization's source of energy. Activities might include construction, maintenance, and operation of these infrastructures, plus activities that produce food, goods, education, healthcare, entertainment, conveyance, communication, R&D, extraction, waste management, recycling, and defense. Population can be described by people in development, people in leisure, workers, and people in retirement. The supplies might include extractions from the Earth's crust, minerals, metals, oil, gas, coal, and uranium. Revenue from Earth's natural capital systems, for example, soil, air, water, flora, and fauna, and stockpiles of materials which have already been mined and refined, but are not embedded in the infrastructure or produced inventory. This image can be converted into a program that plots the changes of each variable and each flow over time. When Meadows did this in 1972, their program looked like this. Their plots forecasted population rising, which did happen, and supporting resources falling, which did not. The error in forecasting might have been caused by enormous increases in the use of fossil fuels to produce additional food and to make up for the increased difficulty of acquiring materials. However, now that some of these fuel deliveries are expected to fall precipitously in the next 30 years, the Meadows forecast that billions of people will perish may be correct. So let's do what the NASA engineers did. Propose changes in the flows and quantities in this model until we find a set where civilization won't collapse and cause injury. As a first step, we should consider removing extractable from the crust from the supply section, because during this century, the energy provided by coal, oil, gas, and uranium will be less than the energy expended to deliver it. Also, mining the remainable minerals and metals from the crust will take more energy than the energy to recycle them from the waste stream. Removing extractable from the crust allows removal of infrastructures like wells and mines and refineries and power plants. It also allows downsizing of transportation elements like pipelines, coal cars, and rail lines. It allows removal of some production activities, for example, extraction and the downsizing of these. This allows removal of some labor forces, for example, miners, and the contraction of others. In case you missed it, removing the extracting of oil, coal, gas, and uranium also remove the primary energy source of civilization. There are other energy sources, solar voltaic, solar thermal, and wind turbines, but they are not exact replacements for the ones we removed. Oil in the past has richly supported our civilization, even after it used its own energy to facilitate its production and deliveries and supporting its workers. Conversely, wind turbines expanding their own energy to complete these tasks and repair and replace themselves may not have enough remaining energy to sustain civilization. One reason for this doubt is that these alternative energy sources are dilute and require an extra step, condensing before they are useful in running civilization. Think of a whiskey still creating alcohol. After you use it to build the still, heat the still, grow the corn, harvest the corn, and support the moonshiners, there may not be much left to power civilization. Dismal as various energy condensing systems appear, we can insert each one into our simulation to determine its actual capabilities. To make such a run using windmills, we have to add wind farms, collection grids, and energy storage devices. We have to expand construction, maintenance, operations, and recycling activities, and we have to increase the expenditures of labor, mass, and energy. We have almost completed a simulation which can tell us if the wind turbine powered civilization is sustainable. Just a few more steps to eliminate the structural changes that occurred when we stopped extracting supplies from the crust. For example, this change stopped any increases in the mass of every material and metal in civilization. It means we either keep recycling the mass we have or we lose it forever. Constant mass also means constant population. Births must equal deaths. Workers retiring must equal people in development entering the workforce. And the amount of labor is constant. If you want to increase the number of teachers, you have to diminish the number of soldiers. If the population is constant, the base supporting goods and services to support them must remain constant or at least not diminish. Another factor in sustainable civilization analysis is that revenue from natural capital is constant. The interaction between the sun and the earth produces fixed revenue. A sustainable civilization's consumption cannot exceed this revenue. What remains in this image are the variables and flows of a wind-powered civilization. To be sustainable, groups of these variables and flows have to equal other groups. For example, energy produced equals the energy consumed in all these activities. Total mass of some material, for example, copper equals the mass of the copper distributed among infrastructure, goods in process, and stockpiles. Total population equals the people in development plus the people in leisure, plus the people at work, plus the people in retirement. Total labor equals the labor allocated to each productive activity. Total revenue has to be greater than what is used in the sum of all these activities. An additional concept that will perfect our analysis is that causal loops must identify and prevent losses of materials to waste. For example, mass flows from stockpiles to construction, from construction to infrastructure, from infrastructure to recycling, and from recycling to stockpiles must be leak-free or civilization loses this type of mass. For sustainable civilizations, causal loops also provide another guide to analysis. They help identify and prevent violations of causality. For example, energy limits food produced. Food produced limits population. Population limits labor. Labor limits construction. Construction limits infrastructure. Infrastructure limits produced energy, and produced energy limits food production. To start a search for a sustainable civilization, first answer these 4 questions. What process is condensing the sun's energy? What level of goods and services is supplied to each person? What percentage of the population works? And what is the revenue stream? Distribute your fixed supporting resources among the pie chart segments and identify the constraint loops. You will need a spreadsheet program that graphs the values of variables at points in time. Each civilization design that is tested will show if it gracefully supports its members and ecosystem, or kills its constituents and destroys the supporting environment. By performing this form of sustainable civilization analysis, we can know if our children's future will be bleak or bright. Now that you have this map, let me describe the initial conditions of our imagined civilization. All of this infrastructure is in place. All of these production and recycling processes are working. All of these people have jobs, food, education, and healthcare. All of these stockpiles have reserves to allocate. There are no mines or wells contributing to these stockpiles. Nature's services are being utilized at below the renewing rates, and the only source of dense energy is from hydroelectric dams. Next, we imagine the civilization's size. How many people, with what services, with output from what collection of dams? To calculate its population, we needed to know how much energy it takes to support one person, how much it takes to transport him and his goods, how much it takes to build and maintain his home, deliver and prepare his food, make and clean his clothes, create his toys, power his services, maintain his military and government, create and maintain his infrastructure, provide his entertainment and recreation, and deliver 12 to 20 years of full-time education. To make this estimate, we took all the energy used for a year in the United States from all sources to produce all services. Then divided it by the US population, 306 million people. After some unit conversions, this calculation suggested that 96,000 kilowatt hours of energy was used for each American each year. Then we computed how much energy had been delivered by a collection of connected dams. When we divided by the 96,000 kilowatt hours, it provided our first estimate of the number of people living like Americans if all they had was hydroelectric power. It was 6 million. Since the energy to provide the services that we imagined in our map was different than what was normal in the USA, we had to make some adjustments to the population estimate. The first was that fossil fuels, 83% of energy used by Americans when burned to make electricity and run transportation, converts only 1/3 of its energy to work, the black. 2/3 of the energy converts to waste heat, the gray. Conversely, the energy in water behind a dam converts 2/3 of its energy to work. Only 1/3 is wasted. Using hydropower instead of fossil fuels to produce transmission line power almost doubled the estimate of supportable population. Substituting subway transport for roads, bridges, cars, parking garages increased our population estimate. Since we imagined an isolated civilization, there was no need for airports and airplanes, and this increased our population estimate. Not including mining, refining, and military increased our population estimate. Strategically locating our civilization's housing, work, farms, and manufacturing services to minimize transport distances increased our population. High-rise buildings use more energy in elevators. However, if the elevator exits people at school, office, shopping, or subway, total energy for these living situations might be lower than suburban living. This increased our estimate of population. Choosing a location with mild weather, Lower heating and cooling needs increased our estimate. And choosing dams that provide least grid losses, easy access to maintenance trains, distance to generator and turbine services increased our estimates of population. These considerations made some dams in the United States not worth including in our imagined civilization. For example, the Tennessee River dams were not included. Something we did not consider a year ago was that changing weather reduced water flowing into the dam. This decreased our population estimate. When making steel or concrete, using electrical energy rather than oil or gas energy takes more energy and lowers the estimate of supportable population. The energy used in recycling in the imagined civilization would be many times larger than that allocated in today's civilization. This greatly reduced our estimate of supportable people. Since we did not have fossil fuels in our imagined civilization, we did not have natural gas to supply the hydrogen for the Haber-Bosch process to make nitrogen fertilizer. If we use dam energy to electrolyze water to make the hydrogen, this also greatly reduced the supportable population. So we looked for a third process to get nitrogen into the soil. We imagined land naturally regenerating it. For example, we let it lie fallow. According to our calculations, the regeneration process took 15 years to replace the nitrogen removed by intensive agriculture. This meant the land area farmed had to be 15 times bigger than normally needed to feed 10 million people. This expanded area greatly increased the transportation costs of getting labor to and from the farms to the cities, the harvest to the cities, and the waste from the cities back to the field. Energy-wise, natural nitrogen regeneration just about broke even with Haber-Bosch, and thus it did not affect our population estimate. In the design of processes that provision our imagined civilization, we computed alternative delivery systems for the same product. For example, chicken, red meat, and biodiesel. The railroad that supports the grid link that runs between Quebec Hydro and the West Coast runs through Iowa fields that can produce chicken feed. Should the chickens be grown near the field? And only chicken parts shipped to the population center? Or should the chicken feed be harvested in Iowa and trained to chicken farms close to the city's labor? In deciding, we even calculated the energy needed to take the chicken poop back to the Iowa field. Another computation was made for the delivery of red meat to the table. We considered turning the entire prairie from Canada to Mexico, 47,000 square miles, now uninhabited and unfenced, into an open bison range. Calling a bison herd of 60 million head as they migrated north-south across our east-west rail line, we calculated that we could supply 113 pounds of meat per person per year to the city. It was easy to ship the city compost back to the prairie. It was a lot harder to spread it out. We discovered a little side bonus. The butchered bison produced 800,000 tons of waste. The part fat could be turned into the biodiesel. We investigated many processes which resulted in different energy allocations to form many different lifestyles. Each made the supportable population go down and up. While our calculations were crude, when we combined the best dams in the Pacific Northwest, the Colorado River, and the Quebec Hydro, their combined energy was enough to support a 10 million person civilization at modern lifestyles if we excluded cars and planes. That was good because some members in the team felt if people wanted postgraduate education, universal health care, European housing, jobs, symphony tickets, ability to launch kids, and an urban living environment, the minimum population would be 10 million people. Doing these crude calculations was an eye-opener for two reasons. One, there were only 3 places on Earth where dams could be connected to produce enough power to support at least 10 million people: the Pacific Northwest, China, and South America. 2, confining human civilization to just 3 city-states and leaving 95% of the Earth's land area void of human habitats, human demands on the environment would be below ecological production. Earth's sustainability is Earth's natural condition when energy deliveries limit human activity. Ta-da! While the team had produced this map, which outlines locations of flows of mass and sources of allocations of energy, the map does not describe 10 million sets of human behavior that keep the civilization from producing injury, or the processes that ensure these behaviors were taken. Identifying these behaviors was not a simple task. We had to step outside our present culture, which was shaped and driven by our genes. We were fully aware that these genes will still exist in the people who will inhabit our imagined civilization. However, if we wanted the imaged civilization not to produce injuries, we would have to find some ways, potentially using civil laws, to force these behaviors into daily operations of individuals and groups. Our map was so different from today's. We were working outside of our experience. The injury events to be avoided had not yet happened. We had to discover them before they existed. The behaviors that would avoid these injuries had never been imagined, let alone tried. It required the team to do some special kind of thinking. We used an anticipatory control process to imagine various behavior constraints. Then, in our imaginations, we applied them to 10 million sets of behavior to determine if they prevented injury. We derived these trial constraint behaviors from tracing the map's energy flows, mass flows, conflict processes, constituent activities, and civil management. This short narrative cannot provide the thinking and discovery that happened over the last several decades, but I can give you an overview of some of our discoveries. Let me describe what we discovered when we traced energy flows. Human behavior had no control over energy delivered to our imagined civilization. The sun evaporates ocean water, lifts it into the air, moves it inland over the mountains, rains it down, and streams guide it to reservoirs behind dams. We learned that the energy potential of water behind a dam has a finite life. The water produces work if it passes through a turbine. However, if it spills over the top of the dam, it produces no energy. So the energy from rain has to be used each year. Trying to save it for next year is like water over the dam. Our plan was to have these turbines produce 96,000 kilowatt hours 10 million times. However, we also knew if we did not put in some new behavior constraints, some energy would be wasted in conflict. Some would be wasted in inefficient infrastructure like freeways and suburbs. And some would be wasted in repairing things we needlessly broke, for example, pollution cleanup. I will come back to describing the constraints we imagined to prevent wasted energy. Let me focus on the portion that was not wasted. Part was allocated to providing paid services to each member of the civilization. Each received basic housing, heat, light, water, garbage, and so on, full health care, transport, free subways. There were no cars or roads or planes, access to the community's assets, museums, parks, and recreation, and 25 years of education. Part was even allocated to advance the arts and sciences. The remaining not wasted kilowatt hours were divided equally among 10 million people. The energy was given like cash in the form of kilowatt-hour tokens. Each token was a demand on energy stored in water behind the dam, which meant it was dated for expiration. These tokens could be exchanged for food, hard goods, service, or applied to personal projects. This flow of tokens directed the activities of the civilization. Food purchases directed agricultural activities that determined if cherries or apricots were grown by farms. Goods purchased directed manufacturing of toasters or sweaters. Service purchases determined the production of symphonies or rock concerts. Personal expenditures drove the invention of a new product and the advancement of the arts and sciences. Kilowatt-hour tokens caused goods and services to be denominated in energy units produced by turbines. The flow of energy tokens also capped civilization's activities to its energy flow. Following energy flows helped us discover behavioral constraint candidates. Next, to imagine additional candidates, we'll focus on mass flows. This map displayed the concept of conservation of mass. For example, there were no mass inflows into the civilization from mining, drilling, and land annexation. And it showed there were only 4 classes of mass inside a civilization: used land area, stockpiled materials, materials or land embedded in possessions of an individual, and finally, materials and land embedded in civil projects. We imagined a behavioral constraint that gave control over the transfer of empty land or stockpiled material into the possession of an individual or a civic project to a committee representing the next 100 generations. The committee determines if the material is recyclable to its initial condition, or if the land is returnable to its original condition. The committee never allows the transfer of materials or land that cannot be returned in its initial state. For example, fossil fuels would never be transferred. The committee charges the receiver an annual rent for any possession, and the committee charges a prepaid fee for recycling to guarantee that if land or material is abandoned, it can be returned to stockpiles or to pristine condition. If you have not noticed, giving this control to the 100 Generations Committee converted 10 million people who are living in this civilization to renters. The only private property owners in our imagined civilization are the next 100 generations. We had used energy flows and mass flows to discover behavioral constraints. Next, we will trace conflict processes to identify them. The first constraint we discovered was isolation. These 3 possible sites were far enough apart. Their materials and land were inside boundaries they were not allowed to cross. In this state, the 3 civilizations were not competing with each other for anything. They needed no army to defend their possessions, which means they needed no dam energy to maintain the army. The second set of constraint behaviors were discovered by tracing how hierarchy creates conflict. Given that hierarchy is driven by genetics, what behavioral constraints could limit its creation? The first constraint we imagined was to provide a minimum well-being to every constituent. We proposed providing a minimum basic income. Additional well-being could be acquired by providing goods or services to others for kilowatt-hour tokens. The second was to not allow the exchange process to create hierarchy. Since the civil sector was the largest employer, we proposed the best paying civil job would not pay more than 5 times the lowest paid civil job. We would make civil employment contracts fixed term. open competition at each job's contract renewal, and let the labor market establish wages. Civil employment would be a meritocracy. This wage structure also allows the garbage collector who does not want to do his job to be paid more than a research scientist who loves his job would come to work without pay. Because the civil sector is the biggest expender of damn energy, capping maximum pay creates a large middle class. These constraints do not perfectly limit hierarchy in the civilization. For example, they don't constrain acquisition of wealth beyond civil wages. To prevent the creation of hierarchy from consolidating wealth created outside of civil wages, we imagined a control called intergenerational wealth dilution. Before I can explain the behavior constraints that implement intergenerational dilution, I need to explain how in this civilization with no individual ownership of mass and kilowatt hour tokens that expire, some people can appear to be wealthier than others. Consider being a participant in projects that produce kilowatt hour tokens for the sale of product. The tokens from sale expire in the year of the sale. Since they cannot be saved, they cannot, in token form, create accumulated wealth, hierarchy, conflict, or injury. If they are spent, wages, rents for mass, services, they have no visibility. And if they are spent on new productive equipment, effectively, they are also hidden. Tokens that are converted into unsold inventory, paid for production equipment, investment in other producers' inventory, and increases in stockpile materials are also hidden wealth and don't create hierarchy, conflict, or injury. Let me give an example. If your process makes toasters and you have paid all your wages and rents, your produced unsold inventory is wealth. If your process creates non-mass objects like operating systems for computers, your hidden wealth is your product's capacity to create token flow in future sales. There are two limits to this growth in hidden wealth: market saturation, everyone already has your product, and two, the public's purchasing power, which is capped by damn output of tokens, is exhausted. When the token flow is used to make visible acquisitions, then they create hierarchy, conflict, and injury. Now, with this definition of wealth for our imagined civilization, let's return to intergenerational wealth dilution as a means of controlling the hierarchy, conflict, and injury. We look for behavior constraints that did not inhibit a person's efforts to create these production processes or damage their existing productive capability after application of our constraints. We recognize the processes as the power to advance the arts, sciences, and well-being of civilization. We imagine two ideas. Both have to do with dilution, not diminishment, of the process's value stream at the end of the process creator's life. The first was limitation of size of disbursement of this wealth. Limited size disbursement means that when the owner wills his wealth, which is a flow or potential flow of tokens, also its rent obligations, to his heirs, the size of the gift is limited to some fraction or multiple of 96,000 kilowatt hours. A very wealthy person like Bill Gates has to give his entitlement in Microsoft to a very large number of people. Instead of creating one heir with a token flow 200,000 times bigger than the biggest civil servant, there are now 50,000 people with incomes twice the highest paid civil servant. This dilution caps the token flow hierarchy of the civilization, and there are a lot of richest people. The second behavior constraint we imagine is that intellectual property at death moves into the public sector. The people who are responsible for Microsoft can still sell its product or support of product at market value, but they can no longer protect the service from competition or the product from duplication. Patent or intellectual property rights expire at the death of the creator. So far, we have derived constraint behaviors from energy flows, mass movement, and conflict processes. Next, we consider behavior constraints that derive from injury related to constituent activities. In our civilization, there are many constituent constraints that could be applied to individual activities, and I'll present just three. Habitat restrictions, personal responsibility, and motivation to action. Habitat restrictions include spatial boundaries that separate the civilization's activities from the Earth's ecosystem. The constraint is that people are allowed to enter ecospace only for recreational camping, take only pictures, and leave only footprints. Next, the imagined civilization can only provide healthcare, education, transportation if they share an efficient and therefore dense infrastructure. If people move to suburbia or out in the woods instead of living in high rises, they would need more hospitals. The fixed energy allocation for healthcare would be spread thinner, and everyone would have less service. We imagined increasing personal responsibility. The 100-generation ownership of mass means that the real-time possession of the mass in the civilization is limited to rental agreements assigned to an individual. He or she is personally responsible. There are no limited liability corporations. If a group of individuals pools their rented mass to make goods and to sell, each individual is an independent mass provider. Each personally prepaid recycling fees and must pay annual rents. If the group's activities corrupts the individual's rented mass, the individual person faces cancellation of the remainder of his rental agreement and confiscation of the prepaid recycling trust. We now have done habitat restrictions and personal responsibility, looking for constraint behaviors. Next, we will investigate motivations of action. People's motivation for choosing their activities in an imagined civilization is similar to what we have today. Financial rewards, kilowatt-hour tokens for personal behavior in our imagined civilization normally accrue from wages and production sales. However, there is one major difference. People, to achieve personal kilowatt-hour tokens, don't have to work for wages or income from production. The allocation of dam energy means they don't need any additional kilowatt hours to receive the same civil services and base discretionary allowance of tokens. The team had serious reservations as to the fairness of base minimum income. It did a little thought experiment to put the basic income into a fairness perspective. Each of us asked ourselves what portion of the services he or she consumed is accomplished by our direct work, and what portion is accomplished by our invisible energy slaves. We accomplished this by asking what services would go away if we lost our energy supply: car, heat, light, grocery store, healthcare, education, almost everything. We realized that most of our goods and services were created and delivered by energy slaves. So if these energy slaves in our imagined civilization are provided by the dam output and each individual got the same share free, where is the unfairness? We are nearing the end of my narrative of our search for behavioral constraints that prevent injury. The last area is about constraining the managers. We discovered that no matter how well an engineer designs a system to be easily managed, a human operator can figure out a way to crash it. There are two civil managements in our imagined civilization: the dam's energy distributors and the mass conservers. The dam energy distributors have three responsibilities. The first was shifting energy among alternative civil services. For example, changing golf courses into soccer fields or vice versa, or more difficult choices like changing allocations of energy from hip replacements to kidney transplants. The second kind of decisions were shifting the percentage of dam output energy from a person's elective kilowatt hours to civil services. For example, like changing the number of years of free education from 25 down to 24 or up to 26. A third area of behavior that created injuries, which we gave to engineering distributors to control, was bursts that determined population size. Because dam energy was fixed and each person was allotted an equal portion of that energy, an allotment for a newborn was available only if someone died. Therefore, we imagined giving civil management the task of making births equal to deaths. This meant controlling the number of births. While these controls none of us wanted to address, upon inspection, we realized that we did not have the expected problem of too many births. We had the opposite problem: too few. In our small civilization, where each of the 10 million people was needed to accomplish all of its tasks, too few births meant we would lose the first chair violinist in the symphony. This meant we needed an average 2 births per woman to have the violinist. We discovered that in a developed society, about a third of the women, by choice or health, chose to have no children, and 1/3 of the women chose to have only 1 child. To achieve 6 births for these 3 women, the third woman would have to have 5 children. Of course, if she didn't want 5, but she wanted 4, that would be all right. If another woman would want 6, and if a woman did not want 4, but wanted 3, it would be okay if another would have 7. And for any woman that wanted 2, it would be okay if another could have 8. This meant not only could every woman have as many children as she wanted, there was a good chance that there would be not enough births to maintain the 10 million person population. This condition gave the energy distribution civil management group an additional responsibility to provide incentive to some of the women to have an extra child. This was done by shifting dam energy from its distribution to 10 million people to a civic project which created births incentives. Now, we have described some of the extra responsibilities of the management team to keep our imagined civilization from creating injury. However, we did not describe the constraints we had to add to keep the group of managers from going off the rails and being the injury creator. Civic managers' control levers were limited to altering or maintaining the allocation of energy flow of the dam to civic tasks. To keep these decisions fair to everyone, we considered a design as referenced by Kim Stanley Robinson in his Mars trilogy. Energy distributors are randomly conscripted from the adult population, serve only 1 decision cycle during their lifetime, with no pay. Deliberations are not public. Their votes, even to other manager decision makers, were secret. You vote your own conscience with your own mental abilities, and you can choose your own staff to help you with your research, but the staff serve at no pay, were isolated from the outside influences for a parallel time period of the team member they serve, and cannot ever staff another civilian manager in their lifetime. The next part of the narrative describes behavioral constraint candidates that could be applied to the civil management group charged with promoting the assets of the 100 generations. First, let me describe some of the decisions they make that could be manipulated by behavioral constraints that we might imagine. Renting the 100 generations assets to the present generation. The management team decides if the renters were the highest bidder for the asset, had good prospects of paying the rental fees over time, and the project has a low chance of creating damage to the mass. Mass that could be recycled, for example, fossil fuels, would not be rented because oil, once burned, cannot be returned in its unburned condition. Phosphorus cannot be rented if its use put it at risk of dilution to a point it could not be recovered and returned. To ensure that the rental mass was returned in the initial condition, the managers established prepaid recycling fees, like an apartment cleaning deposit, that reflect the energy costs of separating the rental mass from any mixture the renter might make. While the mass conservers enforce mass distribution and reclamation within the civilization's boundaries, mass beyond the boundary is treated by the management group as if it is already rented. The ecosystem accepts no civilization waste and allows no extraction and transport back to civilization. Next, we look for behavior constraints that prevented these conservation of mass decision makers from creating injury. The decision makers were a very special group. They have to act as if they are not themselves and as if their families are not their families. Their unborn distant cousins are more important than their living families. They have to make decisions as if they were going to live not tomorrow, but in 200 years. They are conserving the mass, not for themselves or the other members of the living civilization. They are conserving mass for the next 100 generations. They have to operate with values that have not existed in the past and present. None of us thought any human could do it. We were all too susceptible to our emotions. While artificial intelligence did not exist when we did our first review of behavioral constraint candidates, today's AI might be able to make rational decisions without emotion. AI might be able to create values which are extensions of rationality, not our visceral feelings, and created by our limbic brainstem. This is big time. This is the end of my narrative about a team that imagined a sustainable civilization. To close, I would like to link this imaginary non-injury producing civilization to the real world. After the movie, I will be glad to take your questions. If our task is to create conditions for the next generations, we must visualize how civilization works before we choose behaviors that create those conditions. However, the world is complicated. There are lots of cities, farms, manufacturing facilities, mines, wells, and many transportation systems. If this is your view of how things work, it gives no indication of where the world is going. To overcome the failure of vision, this video breaks the whole world into a few simple interacting chunks and uses them to show which behaviors create which conditions. Let me begin by using 4 simple machines to describe the whole world: humans, plants, weather, and animals. Plant machines convert sunlight into food. Weather machines convert sunlight into wind, rain, rivers, and valleys. Non-human animal machines convert solar-created food into meat. Human machines gather plants and animals and use them to replace worn-out machines. Using all the surface of the world, sunlight can support 100 million machines. The same sunlight can support 100 million hunter and gatherers. When human machines do more than hunt and gather, they also burn wood, plant crops, and domesticate animals. And this configuration spreads over the whole Earth. Sunlight supports 600 million. Next, imagine that each human machine has two attached tanks, something like your car's gas tank, one filled with coal, oil, gas, and uranium, and the other with minerals and metals. With these tanks, each human machine can provide more than a few replacement machines. They can produce goods and services. And they can produce machines that perform all kinds of additional processes. When the tanks of each machine is full, 7.8 billion of them can be productive on Earth. However, when any machine's tank runs dry, its production ends. Of the 7.8 billion machines, 600 million solar-powered machines keep producing, while 7.2 billion machines with empty tanks stop. To prevent this civilization contraction, some machines were set up to work extracting resources from the Earth's crust, transporting it, refining it, and piping it into their tanks. Some were set to work building and maintaining the supporting infrastructure, and some were set to work manufacturing replacement machines. Using crustal resources, the tanks of 7.2 billion machines can be kept full. Sunlight supports the rest. However, there is a problem. These energy and material delivery machines were designed to do their extraction from the richest locations in the crust, those having the shortest transportation distance and those where it was the easiest to process. When these locations are mined out or pumped dry, the machines had to move their extraction activities to reservoirs and ore bodies that were deeper, smaller, and less dense. That required greater mining infrastructure, additional transport, and more processing. On this path to ever lesser quality mining sites means the consumption of the machines tasked with obtaining and delivering energy and materials eventually exceeds their production, and their tanks are empty. While the 600 million sunlight-powered machines keep producing, everything else stops. Let's assume that the machines could foresee this decline in delivery of energy and materials to 7.2 billion machines and the contraction of their civilization. They try to create new machines like solar panels, wind turbines, and fusion reactors, and new infrastructure to support them. They hope this new production will replace the energy and materials that can no longer be delivered from the crust. However, if these efforts don't keep these tanks full, this machine civilization will contract to just the sun-powered machines. Now, does this simple big chunk model help us see how our world works? Let's replace these machines with people. Earth is feeding 7.8 billion people. People are mining minerals and pumping energy reservoirs until they can't. The development of alternative energy and material delivery systems don't seem to be coming online fast enough. So in our future, Maybe in 2100, when we cannot extract crustal resources, sunlight will feed 600 million people like 17th century serfs. Most of the global population that lives after 2050 will experience starvation. And during the next 80 years, 8 to 10 billion people could starve to death or die in conflict over food. Maybe this chunky model can tell us some other possible futures. In 2100, the sun will still be shining. Ocean water will still be evaporating. Rain will still be falling in the mountains. Rivers will still be filling existing reservoirs behind dams. These dams will still be creating enough electric power to allow 50 million people to live almost our present lifestyles. That is, if they will confine their homes to 3 specially designed cities located to obtain their energy from today's hydro dams. And they will constrain their behavior as defined by some new social rules. These social rules have some other benefits. They prevent civilization from returning to bad conditions. Because civilization contraction does not include collapse, the arts and sciences are not lost and continue to advance, which means new energy sources might be implemented. The ecosystem can recover because the footprint of 50 million people constrained to live in 3 city-states uses less than 2% of the globe's land area. 98% reverts to the state, resulting from no human inhabitants. During the contraction from 7.8 billion people to 50 million, the new social rules of behavior allow people to die of old age instead of starvation and conflict. In making these predictions, this chunky model has not included the effects of advancing technology. For example, dark energy or fusion energy deliveries change these predictions. However, should these advances not arrive on time, this chunky model predicts 7.8 billion sets of human behavior will determine if civilization contracts to either 600 million serfs or 50 million moderns. Humankind has the chance for a bright future. However, they have to choose behavior very carefully.
Even if, sorry, let me start again. So very interesting presentation, Jack. I have a question that's related to human nature. What I would like to know is, if this incentive scheme is too generous, in fact, even if it's absent, and that is too generous, and we end up with too many babies, how could we avoid the same overshoot predicament that we now have?
Which answer do you want? The one you want to hear or the one you don't want to hear?
I'd like to know the one that your team considered, if it in fact did consider it. And if it wasn't considered, I'd like to know whichever answer you want to provide.
If we had to get 7.8 billion people down to 50 million by 2100, which is not what the video is about. The video is simply a discussion of what does sustainable look like. And you're asking questions about how we get from here to there. Once we get there, the same controls work as how we got there. And that is, everybody is sterile in this civilization, and that anybody who wants a baby gets a permit. And the permits are pretty easy to get. But if you don't have one, you don't have a baby. Okay. Now, this is not, this says the normal human mind, the one that was created by 300,000 years of genetic mutations, doesn't create anything that's sustainable. You can't expect you and me to make decisions that are sustainable. We probably couldn't even make good decisions as the 100 generation representative. It probably can't be done. And that's okay. But you have to decide whether or not this painful experience of having some of your genetic freedoms taken away is worth it. Nobody likes stop and go lights, but we all obey them. And it's exactly the same model. You have to decide whether or not the thing that was taken away from you is bigger or smaller than the benefit you got. Okay, or the damage that would have accrued if you didn't sacrifice your freedom. So we've gone off the rails, or not. We haven't. The rails don't lead to a viable environment for humankind on Earth. And what we're doing is conceptualizing. If you like it, put a big long list of things you want to keep. And then let's talk about what you have to give up to get there and then keep them. Does that help?
Yep, indeed. Thank you.
I don't, when it goes back to Catton and Pimentel, we weren't talking about viruses. We were so far back in time, we thought one kid per family would be adequate. Okay, and we thought we could socially engineer one-child families, and that if we had one-child families, that the population would continue to go down. And for the 30 years that I was at Stanford, I spent most of my time trying to figure out how infants kept the cognitive abilities they needed to anticipate future conditions they didn't want to experience, and therefore could choose one kid instead of two. It turned out about 6 or 7 years ago that I figured out one-child families, if we really made it universal, would end us. What that means is that the population would go down, but when it got to the sustainable population, it would just keep going down. Everybody would be so used to having one-child families that we wouldn't be able to maintain our population. So what the new mathematics said was, doesn't get us down fast enough, and if you get it in place, you can't get rid of it fast enough. So you really need a management system that's based on abstractions, not on rules.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And so Peter McKinnon, if I call on you for the next question, and John Myers, do you have a question next?
Thank you, Ted. And thank you, Jack, for a very provocative presentation. You were certainly compressing an awful lot of change into a very short period of time. So that's my view. I have a two-part question, and it's very simple. And it's somewhat like your answer, perhaps, to the earlier question. But I'm interested to know, in this transition from today to your visioned future, say 2100, as well as getting to there, as well as after that, how do we pay for it and how do we govern?
Those are really good questions. And I want you to know that they're bigger than what I covered. There's really three parts to this. How bad a shape are we in and where are we going? What's a working system look like? And the third one is, how do you make the transition? Okay. And I've done a huge amount of work on all three questions, but I didn't include it in this talk. I'll give you just a little taste. Let's assume that you really have a civilization of 8 billion people, and they're all sterile. Okay. And you give out 500,000 birth permits a year, which means in 100 years, you're going to have 50 million people. You're also going to have 8 billion people dying of old age. And we're going to keep them separated. Okay, if you get a permit, you and your family go live in one of these isolated cities, and we're going to use the wealth of the world to build these cities out and to transfer the artwork of the Louvre, and we're going to fill the storehouses full of materials, titanium and copper, and but the people on the outside get to live their lives exactly as normal. So what does that mean? It means at the end of the first year, you have no babies. At the end of the second year, you have no toddlers. At the end of the 12th year, you have no grade school teachers or grade schools. You have no, at the end of the 21st year, you have no colleges. You have no, I mean, you still have educational facilities, but the youngest person in the outside world, outside the city, will be 21. Okay. In the 50th year, the youngest person is going to be 50. Now, what happens to all the private property and wealth? Well, they just keep consolidating. They keep giving it away until the last man standing owns the whole thing. And when he dies, it belongs to nature, because the people in the cities can't go outside anymore. And the people that were outside the cities died off. Okay, now there was a huge amount of work done trying to figure out. Alan Weissman wrote a book, The World Without Us. There's a huge amount of work to clean things up before they leave. And that's where they're going to have to put their effort. I mean.
Well, I appreciate your answer. I took it though as you were really talking about endpoints, and I was trying to figure out how you were going to get from here to there. So it's
so the endpoint is what I presented.
Yes.
Okay. And even the endpoint, all of the constraints in behavior that I talked about in the current video is just to, if I had it all together, if I got rid of 8 billion people, I only had 50 million. Okay. I'd still have a problem of keeping it together. And that's what this video is about. What sorts of rules keep it together? Bill Rees asked a question in the chat that said he wanted to worry about things that couldn't be recycled. And another woman asked a question, I don't have my glasses on, about entropy. And the answer is, he's right. Okay. If you can't recycle it, you can't have it. You can't rent it, and you don't own it, and you don't own anything. The 100 Generations owns it, and they're making the decisions as if they're important and you're not. You're the renter. So the question was, we had to come up with a strategy of making it work, and the way we made it work was we made everybody who lives in the world a renter. They knowingly can't have things unless they can give them back, unless they can pay a damage deposit, which guarantees they can recycle it. And as far as entropy is concerned, the entropy is sunlight. We're getting it at high energy. It's evaporating water. The water's ending up in a turbine, and we're dissipating it. We are a dissipating system. So the energy is going through, and it's going from high to low in energy. It's leaving the earth in infrared, and it's coming in ultraviolet. Okay, or white light. So we haven't violated any of the engineering rules, or we've tried not to.
Thanks, Jack. So, Bill Rees, do you still have a question?
I do have a question.
Okay, thank you.
Jack and I have talked about this for years. I'm going to throw it at you again. You've created here a mind-bogglingly imaginary future, no question about it. But it's entirely mechanical. You know, it's an engineering model, and it pays no attention to the reality of human behavior or ecosystem behavior or anything like that in the real world. I mean, we can't get people, as I said here, to believe in COVID-19 or in climate change. And you're talking about a country, the United States, which is so divided now that some are arguing it's on the verge of civil war. So my question is, it's always the question I pose to you. How do you go from here to there? I suppose Peter was talking about that a moment ago. How do you get the 337 million people in the US right now to shrink voluntarily to 10 million people who would have enormous constraints on their behavior and lifestyles? And if you can't do that, if you can't give us that, then what's the point of the whole friggin' exercise? I just don't know. We've got to, everybody knows what it ought to look like. Nobody can tell us how to get there without crashing the whole system.
Well, it isn't as if we haven't come to this juncture before, Bill.
I know, that's why I'm asking it again. You have never pushed it beyond this point.
All right. Unless people can get an image of the injury, we're not going to get a change.
Okay.
There is nothing in the United States. There's nothing in Washington. There's nothing in our culture of driving cars on interstates that has anything to do with imagining injury. Okay, there's no injury. There's no reason to give up your summer vacation in Yosemite or wherever you're going to go, or Australia or Europe. And so the context that we have can only be disrupted if a large number of people can get a view of injury. Okay, so the stuff that I'm doing here in Kansas and at Stanford and a few other, Stanford's building a new school, by the way. Okay, they want to call it sustainability and climate change. And I'm saying the school should be called viability, and that you can completely escape any educational activity in the United States or reading any paper or going to Washington anywhere. And there isn't anybody saying what's viable, who's going to get injured and when. And as long as we're distracted by your complaints, which means we can't get Washington to shift its gears to even handle COVID nicely, how are we going to make the move? And my claim is the move is from the bottom up, that our efforts ought to be consolidated into getting one person, just one person to say, I'd put birth control in the water supply if it was the only way forward. Okay. And if you can't get one person to cross the bridge of doing something that is completely outside of our culture, then we don't have any solution, because you're right. All of the control levers that exist today do not have a fart from an engineering point of view. You know, I used to design helicopter controls and visual simulations for the lunar lander, which I can land, by the way. And I can also land the space shuttle, because I played with simulations and I tried to redesign them so that the information coming in could be used. You know, the levers they had what they saw with their eyes, they had to handle with their levers. And if the relation between what they saw and what they handled didn't work, they crashed every time. Okay, and you're correctly perceiving that the levers that people have in Washington and what they visualize is what they're trying to do aren't connected together in any kind of an organized way. That if they were connected in an organized way, then they'd say, what we want, the lever we want to pull, the public won't let us pull it, and we won't be here next term to make these decisions. So we have set up a physical system, a social physical system that is inherently not going to make it. And the only way we can get it to make it is for a big percentage of the people saying, we have to do things we've never done before, because what we're doing now, our kids are going through the meat grinder. And that's what I'm working on. How does one person make the jump? I haven't made you make the jump. I haven't made the Pope make the jump. I can't get the president of the United States. I sent Obama a letter when he won the second election, and I said, you got a chance. You can do fireside chats. You can talk to people. You're smart enough and you're a good communicator. You can say what kind of predicament we're in, and that the levers that we have to pull aren't good enough, and we have to build some new ones. And you're not going to like giving these freedoms away, but we have to do it if we want it to work. I never heard back from them.
Okay, Jack, look, you've talked about this having to be a bottom-up effort. The number of people who have any insight into the nature of this problem is vastly outnumbered by the number of morons who don't have a clue about anything. And right now, I don't know if you've been following the news in Canada, but we've seen a bottom-up resurrection, essentially, that is paralyzing Ottawa. And many of the guys that are on this call aren't able to move around their city because it's full of people who are trying to overthrow the government with their tractor trawlers or crawlers. So what? That's the bottom up. That's the
Wait,
bottom.
now, hang on a second.
Yeah.
What we are really getting to the end of the instability, and these manifestations of January 6th and February 16th in Ottawa were already very close to just falling off the cliff. I don't know. I mean, when I started this in 1968, which I was an automatic controls engineer, and I said, there's no way I can save this system. And that was 50 years ago. And I've been working on it ever since. Okay. We got a lot less time and a lot bigger problems, but we have much bigger tools. I hate to introduce this book, but it's a very good book. It's called The Eden Proposition. And it was written by Kurt Dull, who's a friend. And he said, what would happen if a very rich guy could create a way of reducing the world's population to some very small number, and we could start over? Okay. And the book, this is one rich guy. It was Bill Gates model. Okay. And he had his own special lab, and he figured out how to build this virus. And the virus, once it was released, everybody was contagious, but nobody died for 9 months. So that there was no such thing as realizing you were in trouble. By the time you figured out you were in trouble, you were all dead. All right. So the book is about, he collected somebody from the CDC and from Harvard Ethics and from the Supreme Court, and there's 8 guys, and he shanghais them off to the Queen Charlotte Islands. And he says, this is what I got. What should I do with it? Should I release this virus and restart this system? Or should I just let the thing, the book was written 10 years ago, and it was in 2022 or 2023 when he shanghaied these guys. So the idea is that the skill for a very small number of people to take on the majority and just decimate them is already in place. I mean, when we had the atomic bomb in 1944, how many people knew it was in the garage until they released it? And that was the question is, what's happened in 70 years? What kinds of things are in the garage? You don't think that there's the ability for a very small, it used to be big governments, but now the science has gotten to the point where anybody who wants to will be able to take out the whole world. And I'm struggling with grandmothers over the back fence, but there are other people that have other ideas. And I'm not saying that Kurt Dull is in favor of it. He just laid it out so you could see it. He also wrote another book called The American Famine, where some crazy person took out the electrical grid. And because of it, people in the United States were starving to death. And only a few of them got through. That if you took out the electrical grid, the vast majority of people in the United States wouldn't eat. And to take out the electrical grid is a trivial problem. You know, some kid in 8th grade with a keyboard can do it. It doesn't even have to have, 25 guys with armor-piercing rounds to shoot at transformers at critical junctures in the grid.
If I may say so, Jack, what you stated is a far more realistic vision of the future than our presentation that you gave us earlier.
Absolutely. I'm still working on the long shot. I'm working on it knowing since 1968 that I had very little chance of success. I mean, I read some of the original work by Jay Forrester, which preceded Limits to Growth. And even in the 60s, in 1965, I think I have a paper where I think Dennis and Danella went to the Massachusetts legislature and presented Limits to Growth to the Massachusetts legislature. This is before they wrote the book. And it was absolutely clear then that we were toast.
Well, on that pessimistic note, I'll thank you for that. And I'll go back to John Myers and ask if Lewis R., do you have a question?
Yeah.
I'll follow up after. Thank you.
Okay, Jack, good to see you. I think this is a refreshing exercise because all the rest of us in the room are trying to hammer down our existing society and pound it into sustainability, and you just wipe it off the map and start from the bottom up. So I think it's a great exercise. I do have one issue, and that's the essentially the guaranteed income, where you equate energy slaves to actual workers, but an energy slave is not an actual worker. An energy slave is the energy that an actual worker uses to enhance his output. So I'm just wondering if you could, that really affects the requirement that people work. And so I'm trying to differentiate between energy slave and energy worker. They are not the same thing. So could you address that?
You're 100% correct. I mean,
Okay, good.
but the difference in well-being is 100 to 1
Okay.
between you on your hands and knees in your 2-row garden in your backyard trying to eat, and the energy that allows you to go to the grocery store and buy food.
Yeah.
All right. So yes, you need people. But right now, what we consider life, people don't mean squat. I mean, you could lose let's assume that somebody gas attacked every McDonald's, and nobody could even, they anthraxed them, and nobody could go into a McDonald's anywhere in the world. Okay. Would it change?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Well,
nobody else is watching this, Jack. You've come up with a
No,
lot of dark images here.
I'm not saying anything that hasn't already appeared, in videos made in Hollywood or in Japan, or
Yeah.
everybody's making videos. Even the Australians are making. Mad Max came from
Yeah.
Australia.
Okay. Okay. Good. Well, yeah. Thanks for the answer. Great, thought-provoking presentation.
Thanks.
John, I'll call me. Because
Okay.
John,
Lewis R., that's all I have on the chat. If you have a question, followed by Phil Riley. Are you still there, Lewis R.? Well, can we move right along into Phil Riley, please? Followed by Mike Nickerson.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had the opportunity to go to Biosphere 2 a few years ago and was really intrigued at the infrastructure that had been built and the fact that they had chosen a handful, maybe a few more people, to prove that it was possible to live in a confined, very changed world. I take away from that message because that project failed within 2 years, I think it was, because the people could not get along or accept each other in so many different ways. How are we going to deal with all of these different people that we have to motivate to limit their life expectations, their food, their entertainment, all of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis? Any idea on how to solve the sociologic part of the dilemma of solving the riddle?
well, let's go back to the intersection problem. The intersection problem is where you used to go to this intersection and there weren't any traffic controls. And the cars got bigger and they got faster and they got denser, and pretty soon kids were on Friday nights were getting killed at the intersection. And so the community put in a stop and go light. We didn't change the culture. We didn't change the genetics. People are still frustrated waiting for the light to turn green and feel like they're being abused. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work. And that if you don't put in the street light, that you have to put up with the death at the intersection on Friday nights. So you're talking about the people that exist today and the freedoms that they're used to and they haven't had any losses. You know, between 1944 and 1975, was not a sleigh ride. It was a constantly increasing quality of life, more stuff for less work. And all these people that we're talking about is being angry. They're angry because it's turning out that about 68, things turned flat and then started down. When I worked at General Motors, I had a tech who had a high school education. And he and I ran impact sleds. I designed seatbelts, and he was good. He was really good. And he lived on a beautiful home on a beautiful lake just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And his wife didn't work, and he sent both his kids to the university, and he drove cars that were only 5 years old. And we didn't have a union. This is General Motors. The Proving Grounds didn't have a union. And but from that date, from about 1968, that same job has been less productive. You know, that same guy, his wife is working. He lives not on a house on a lake. He lives in a little shack, and he can't send his kids to college. And so about 1968 was the break where things started to go downhill. And they went downhill slow enough that the kids didn't feel screwed. Right now, things are going downhill really fast, and our kids are feeling a huge pinch because they don't already see that they're not going to do as well as I did, but they're going to have nothing. So you can't use the perception of the present community to do your designs. Okay, you have to do the problem is an abstraction and the solutions are an abstraction. And if you can't create meaning for the two abstractions, we don't have a path out of this. And I want you to know that this abstraction stuff, I'm a learning theorist. That's all the work I did at Stanford. I wrote an interactive computer exam to test people's ability to take a very small amount of information and infer future conditions from it. And I wrote it for 5th graders. Okay, I gave it to 5th graders at the Palo Alto school system, and they didn't do very well on the test. Well, then I brought it back and I gave it to Stanford freshmen, and they didn't do very well. And then I gave it to Stanford faculty, and they didn't do very well. And I gave it to a big slug of graduate students, and they didn't do very well. And then I eventually got to the Nobel laureates and the Wolf Prize winners at Stanford. And from the scores, you can't tell the difference in abilities. That we change a lot of abilities between 5th grade and Nobel laureates, but it's not the kind of abilities that will help you solve this problem. We just don't have it. And we're really going to have to get really clever about what kind of conversation goes over the back fence between two grandmothers that are trying to decide whether or not the problem's bad enough that they're willing to accept a social contract that has all kinds of things in it that they don't want. They've never wanted. Does that help?
Well, that's an answer. I'll let other people chime in now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Mike Dickerson, and if I could ask Paul Beckworth to be on deck, please.
Okay, I'm visually blocked by the host, but my question, this entire scenario that you've put together, Jack, is based on a world like the one that we're used to. And, you know, I am looking at the world that has been living on this planet for a billion years or more, and the things on it live quite well. And I'm just wondering what we can learn from that life process. Like, it doesn't take that much more to make a shelter for human beings. If we're more content with being natural creatures than being these highly civilized creatures.
You really don't want my answer.
Well,
I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back and live in a world where if I scratch myself with a rusty nail that I'm going to die of lockjaw. Yeah. And that's what we're talking about. How far back can we go? How many people can go to their garden and survive in it gracefully with the next door neighbor who's down on his hands and knees in his garden? Now, there's certainly a level of well-being that can occur for a group of people in a given area, as long as they don't expand their space. I mean, just because the people who came across the Bering Strait came from Asia. The question is, why did they migrate at all? And once they got across the Bering Strait, why did they migrate all the way to Terra del Fuego? And what happens if, how did they get to the Atlantic coast? Because what you're proposing, this simpler life, I don't think has viable roots. That you have to solve this problem in terms of first derivatives, not in terms of numbers, not in terms of static numbers. Can I live in my house with a wood burning stove and an acre garden and some chickens? And I have deerskin windows and horse leather hinges in my door. And eventually all the metal parts in my house are gone. We can do that. I mean, people, teepees are teepees and they work, and they followed the buffalo up and down the prairies, and they survived. And even they weren't so peaceful, but they didn't have to advance their technology to make it. So I don't see going back. I don't think anybody's going to want to go back. Somebody asked the question in the chat about going to Mars or the moon, and two books that would probably help with that is Heinlein's book, "The World is a Cruel Mistress," Harsh Mistress, and the other one was Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Mars Trilogy, in which they're talking about how much civilization can be put together on another planet and make it and be viable. And whether or not you can get there and you don't have any hiccups and you don't die, I don't know. The Mars Trilogy is harsh. Another one is The Martian. You can see that one in a movie form, of a guy who got left and had to make it for a while until they came back and got him. I don't see going back, and I don't see going forward. I see how do we get past 2100?
I agree that you can't go back, because that's not the direction that we're allowed to go in time. We have learned a lot. We've developed our mental capacities in ways that we hadn't at the previous time. And there are technologies that are much less invasive than other technologies. And there's certainly a lot of healthcare that can be maintained with knowledge and local resources. So, there is an opening there, and I think it's at least as viable as imagining a population of 100 million.
Okay.
Well, we'll work on it. I'll meet you 2200, and
I'll meet you anytime you zoom in my office. This is where I live, and I'll be glad to talk to you. And in fact, I offer the opportunity to anybody listening at CACOR. Go to my website. My telephone number is there. The website is skill.org. And I'll be glad to talk to you. I want to hear every idea. I am really stuck. I've been stuck for 50 years.
So thank you. So if I could ask for Paul Beckworth, followed by Ted Manning, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Jack. Very interesting. And I'm the person who I actually put in the very first comment in the whole chat session about Mars and the moon. So I would argue that, Elon Musk has thought deeply about all of these questions, and his whole life and his whole set of companies is geared to doing exactly what you're talking about, but in his vision of he wants geographical separation between people on the earth and, a sustainable civilization. He's talking about Mars, right? Colonies on Mars. And he's, so his whole goal for his existence, I mean, you can get quotes from him 25 years ago saying he wanted to make humans a multiplanetary species. So every single company that he has is connected to that, if you look at it. I just, in fact, released a video last night on talking about him and all these connections. And I really think one of the best ways to address climate change is to just block a small fraction of the sunlight hitting the Earth. And I think that Mars, that SpaceX's new heavy launch capability and the drop of a factor of 10 or 20 from any previous launch capability can actually start deploying things like that. Now, you mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's books about Mars, the trilogy. I have that, and his most recent book is all about scenarios on Earth, like mass starvation, in Asia, India, for example, in the next sort of, I don't know his time frame, next decade or so. So what do you think about that? I mean, my problem with 3 cities on Earth separated is, one city will sacrifice its long-term viability for militarizing and for then taking over one of the other city-states.
Now they're not...
And eventually we'll be back down to one city-state in turmoil. I mean, it's just human nature to go and take what other people have. So, if you separate them, so I would argue that, a city-state on the moon and one on Mars would be a much better way to go. And you may laugh at all of this, possibly, and say this is absolutely absurd and ridiculous, but I would argue that we've got this one billionaire who has completely revolutionized the car industry, the space industry, the large military contractors that have historically supplied the US space program, et cetera. None of them can believe how far and how quickly Musk has gone. So, I highly recommend you read his biographies that are written by other people. And I would argue that he's probably thinking of deploying something like a solar shade up in space. He's talking about everything else, but he hasn't directly talked about that. That's the purpose of my video. So anyhow, what do you think about this as opposed to your city-states on Earth?
The reason that I'm focused on city-states is I don't see where the energy supply is to facilitate getting to Mars or to the moon anymore. The physical requirements of the mass require a source of energy, which I don't see us having. We have to convert solar light to hydrogen fuels to get off the Earth to make the transport to Mars. Is that what you're proposing? Fusion is a wonderful solution, except that in 1968, that was the year of Sputnik. 4 of the people that were my best friends from the sailing program all went into tokamaks. They worked at General Atomic in San Diego, and they've been there their entire careers. And they were the smartest guys I knew at Wisconsin. And if I talk to them on ski trips, which we still do,
right,
they don't see where the breakthroughs are going to be. Yeah, we're talking about better materials and we're talking about lasers hitting certain concentrations of deuterium, but scaling, even if they suddenly solved all the problems tomorrow, scaling up enough fusion reactors to run our world, and we still need buildings and water and containers and transmission lines and just converting our transportation system to electric. I don't know if you've been following Alice Freeman's blog, which I highly recommend because she's really a no-nonsense lady. She only puts out one little piece at a time. She connects it to another little piece. And when you get done with the building blocks, there's none of this grand scheme.
Yeah. Well, I think that
how are we gonna build? So you're saying maybe we can build a community on the moon that is a viable stepping stone to Mars.
Yes, and then this is what Musk is heading for Mars directly. NASA has got a lot of interest on the moon.
Right.
3 city-states in the locations you've shown on the Earth is a huge problem because with abrupt climate change, once we lose the Arctic sea ice,
We've already
it's
lost.
going to be North Polar regions that are going to be the inhabitable regions, not areas in Central North America or Asia or South America. People will have to migrate and live closer to the poles on our planet if things continue as they are. And I fully expect global food shortages within a decade. I don't see how we're avoiding that.
Okay. And once we have food shortages, do you think that there's any place that people will be able to hide? Like,
no, I mean, I'm living in Ottawa.
Raised question of, can we live smaller? And the question is, anybody with an oil lamp and a tomato is going to be a target to the person who doesn't have an oil lamp or a tomato. They're just going to walk until until they're eating each other, like McCormick McCarthy's The Road.
The Road, yeah. No, it's pretty grim. I mean, take advice from people or questions from people from Ottawa with a grain of salt, because we've had a very traumatic existence for 3 weeks. And I think it's shaken Canada. We looked at January 6th in the US and thought, this couldn't happen here. Or we thought what might happen, if it did happen here, it would be years from now. But anyway.
Are we saying that the system is close to going unstable?
It looks like,
do you think that Musk is going to be able to go to Mars? He'll be able to protect his facilities from the walkers?
He recognizes a very narrow window to possibly do this. A narrow window that is narrowing ever more. But if you look at every single one of his companies, he's very concerned about the issues that we're all concerned about. I mean, look at Tesla and the purpose, Solar City, the Boring Company to bore tunnels under the ground, which in cities for transportation, but it would be a great place to have people living, on Mars or the moon. Hyperloop, transporting people in a near vacuum at aircraft speeds from one city to another. Ideal on the moon and Mars, the vacuum is there. His Neuralink company, his OpenAI company, every single thing he does is geared to keeping humans alive long term. That's his whole reason of being. So anyway, I highly recommend that you look at his stuff in detail.
Can you send me an email?
Sure.
It's Alpert@skill.org.
Yeah, I mean, he's planning on his rocket that is ready to go technologically. They're waiting for environmental assessments from the U.S. government. It's taller than the Saturn V missions to the Apollo missions. It's got double the thrust, I believe. It'll be capable of carrying. He's testing there were a lot of tests last year of the Starship, the upper stage of this, where it comes and it lands on its side. It comes down on its side, brakes, and then the engines kick in and it lands vertically. And then they've got the heavy booster underneath, which they're also going to land. So there's a lot of questions. I mean, is this thing going to work? But he's got some of the best engineers from all of the other aerospace companies, and they're delivering all the time. They're delivering left, right, and center. So I think he's familiar with all of these ideas that you're talking about. And he's actually doing the engineering with all of his companies to try to achieve that. That's my whole argument.
Thanks, Paul. Ted Manning, can I call on you? And Raymond Lurie, could you be next, please?
Yes, thank you. Nostradamus in the list, so I guess some of us have to try and cover for him. I'm a social scientist, so I'm very chagrined about the behavior of bothered us a long time. We've been modeling futures ever since the Club of Rome did. I was doing it in the 70s with IASA and looking at the balance between behaviors, demands, capacity, and the impacts of various changes, including climate change. The biggest issue I have is I think there's an awful lot of technical fixes that are worth exploring. And in fact, we've done a lot of that in these presentations. We have done far less that is useful in terms of dealing with human behavior. And even if we were to come up with some of the nice solutions that everybody's talking about, it becomes exceptionally difficult to change people's behaviors. we're doing a thing through the Club of Rome around the world, looking at essentially how people define well-being and whether in fact there are small nodes where what we would describe as successful long-term well-being still exists. Surprisingly, there are some, but they of course are not beyond the negative influences of other things that we're doing elsewhere. So I'm with Bill Reese in a sense of saying that we have a rough time getting people to do even self-serving and self-saving behaviors. And therefore, I'm very skeptical about being able to foster magnitudes of change like you have, Jack, in terms of what you believe is necessary to reach a model that appears to work on paper. I think we've got an awful lot of work to do to people. My guess is that the model that may work may be rather less strict, radical, and extreme than yours, but we can't even get them moving towards that. And well, in my city, I can hear the horns as they absolutely refuse to even take a vaccine that will save their own lives as well as their families. So it is not easy to cause people to make any changes. And we've been working a lot on that. There are success stories, but they are not general. So where's Nostradamus when we really need him?
Thank you.
Okay.
Good question.
Was that a question?
But are you saying that that's where we should put our time? I mean, how much time do you think we have?
Yeah, well, I belong to a group who's playing with something called the Doomsday Clock. I'm one of the people who comments on it once a year. And that's as close as we can come.
Okay.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay.
I get call on Raymond Lurie, please. And Gabriel, could you still have a question? You'll be next.
Hi, Jack. Actually, just a comment before I ask my question. I think you're right about the space thing. You know, the amount of energy required to get material in space is still a big problem. And if you look at what Musk is doing right now with SpaceX, he's emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gases that would be a real problem if it was scaled to the degree that he would want to scale things. But anyways, my question has to do more with the fact that you seem to limit the energy input to hydro. And what if so things have changed in the solar and wind space over the last 3 decades to the point where I think you assumed that wind return less energy than it took to produce the infrastructure required for wind, right? That's no longer the case with wind and solar. So what if you had a very large oh geez, the cat is anyways. There had to be a cat in a Zoom presentation, right? So what if there was a cheap source of energy that was, for all intents and purposes, almost limitless? How would that affect your projections for the amount of people that could be supported in the models you've run?
If somebody tomorrow figures out a way to tap into dark energy, then most of the problems that we have with 8 billion people, except for the extermination of the ecosystem, are solved. There's no I think when Paul Ehrlich wrote the book Limits to Growth, there's a chapter in not limits to growth, the population bomb. And in it, there's a chapter that says, what's the maximum population on the earth? And the way he did it said, we're going to encapsulate the earth in one building, and it's just going to be spheres inside each other. And it's going to be 1,000 stories high. I lost you. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Okay. So we have this sphere, well, a 1,000-story building, and the limit of the building is the temperature of the titanium on the outside skin as a black body radiator. And then you can have, I don't remember the exact number of people living on the earth, but you had an energy source that was essentially unlimited, and you could supply everything that you really needed, and you were growing your food from this energy source, not solar, and you were recycling everything, that an elevator ride up and down, you would be able to find the Beatles and Einstein, and that was the population density of the Earth. So the question is, if we had unlimited energy, we go to Paul Ehrlich's, 1,000-story building that covers the entire globe, and the only thing that limits the size of the activity is the temperature of the outside material, that it doesn't disintegrate, and it's at a high enough temperature to get rid of all of the heat that was created by this energy source.
Okay, but I would have thought we would run out of other resources to build such an Earth
He didn't
before,
do
right?
that part. He didn't do that part.
Okay.
I mean, this was he wrote that book in 1972.
Yeah.
And but I would like you to go to the Energy Skeptic website, which is Alice Friedman's website, and look to see how she makes the calculations for solar and wind. And when she doesn't say it can't be done, she just says, I don't know how you're going to do it. And she lays it out with numbers. Where would these solar, do you know who Mark Jacobson is? The guy at Stanford that said he could build enough windmills and enough solar and enough nuclear to completely not use fossil fuels. And the man his numbers were so predicated on cherry-picked assumptions that it wasn't reasonable. I mean, 17 guys attacked him, and he tried to take him to court, and he lost. You say solar and wind is now becoming more productive or adequately productive to be a supply of energy. I don't think it is. I think if you tried to run that model that I gave in the talk, and you used solar panels, that you wouldn't make it. And I don't mean do it for 7.8 billion people. I'm saying pick the size of the population, pick the kind of lifestyle, the hospitals and the food and and then take that. When I presented that at a conference, biological economics conference, I said, take an island like Japan, put in a wind system or a solar system, and get everything working, get everything transferred to be electric, and have a fixed population, and you can keep the population constant. The question is, could the island, and then put a barrier around it so that nobody can attack them. Nothing in, nothing out. Could the island become viable? And the answer was nobody could come up with numbers that demonstrated that solar or wind could be the source to keep an island alive and have all the services. The cost of a solar panel has dropped, what, 93%? Some huge number.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't heat your hospital, and that didn't, it didn't make a manufacturing plant that could replace every solar panel that went south, which they do, and recycle the materials in it. And you have to recycle them because you're not allowed to bring any new materials into Japan. You have, whatever you started with is that's it. We'll save you the conflict, but you have to keep it going inside this box. And whether or not it's Japan or the Earth, it's really no different.
But that's a bit of a concerning assumption too, that you can't bring in new material, right? No, right?
Well, wait. The idea is there a design using solar panels that is viable? Or do you constantly have to go out and use diesel fuel to mine the mine and bring in the extra titanium or gallium arsenide or whatever's in your solar panel working?
Yeah, but conceivably though, all the extraction processes could be done through electrified mechanisms, and there's already many mines that are electrifying for cost reasons. Underground mines, if you don't if you don't spew diesel in the air, you don't need to ventilate as much and all that. So there's other reasons to do it, right? So I envisage there could be eventually a supply chain for all the materials for solar that would be decarbonized, right?
Okay. Raymond,
right?
I want to see your numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see you run them. I want you to demonstrate that what you just proposed is viable. That it,
Mhm.
you know, that all of the kilowatts generated and where they're distributed and how they work, and it balances. That solar energy is being used to run this civilization, even including mining. I mean, the reason I didn't include mining in my model was I said at some point mining will be more energy intensive than recycling. And as Bill Rees said, you can't get 100% recycling. You always have some losses, which he's right.
Mhm.
And so in my 300-year model, I said, because we got these managers that are going to watchdog what things get built so that they can be recycled, the losses will be small enough that we're going to make it 300 years, but it only makes it 300 years. Then you really do have to have fusion to keep going, because hydro won't do it. The concrete will disintegrate in the dams. I mean, I called it the sustainability model, but I said it's only good for 300 years. And we got to come up with some real big changes to keep it going. But at least we don't have to make any changes to build it, keep it going, but only 300 years. And the energy coming out of my hydroelectric dams, that's not enough energy to rebuild those dams. It's enough energy to rebuild the turbines and the water chutes one at a time and reclad them. But when the concrete in the Hoover Dam, which is still too hot, it's still giving off heat because all of the chemical reactions of making concrete aren't completed. We can't rebuild that dam with the energy that came out of it. The energy that went into building it were fossil fuels. And as I say, Alice does a very good job. I recommend it to everybody that she does a very good job of laying out the numbers in a very common sense way. No hand waving, no 93% decrease in solar panel costs. Therefore, they're cost effective now. Solar panels aren't cost effective. They don't have any viability. In fact, the people, there are places where they put in solar panels that are, they're dying. They didn't break even on the project.
Thanks, Raymond.
Thanks.
Jack. Gabriel, can I call on you? And Virginia Hammond, could you stand by, please?
Okay, thank you. Fascinating model, Jack. Lots, really. So a very ambitious one too, but a very doomsy as well. I was thinking, how do you get from here to there? Are you still relying on the historic, losing populations through pandemic, wars, and natural disasters?
We'll never recover from that. If we have to go through the next collapse, we will be not only 600 million people living like serfs, but all the low-hanging fruit has been used and there's no recovery. When Rome crashed, lots of places kept going. And then lots of places from wherever they went continued upward with coal and then with oil. But those things are going to be gone. There's no recovery. The next round of 600 million serfs, they're never going to change. They're going to be stuck there forever.
So you're saying from here to 2100,
yes.
What are we going to use as energy and so on, all the things that you mentioned?
Well,
are those developed after?
There's two things going on. Between now and 2100, we're going to have the population drop to 50 million people.
Because? And how?
No births. Or only half a million births per year.
When you say that,
What?
A lot of people will think, oh, well, maybe I don't want to get that vaccination because maybe that will make me.
It won't be a vaccination.
No, I'm just saying.
It will be a flu. You will become sterile because of a flu.
Because of a flu.
You won't be vaccinated.
So a pandemic.
A pandemic with no injuries, except for the fact that we won't be making babies.
Right.
And the question is whether or not that this flu that was made in a laboratory and is distributed by 3 billion people, or whether or not it's distributed by one person.
So who would take that decision?
Well, if it's one person, he'll do it by himself. If it takes 3 billion, it takes 3 billion people to make that decision. And then all the people who don't want to be part of the decision, those people have the same role as slave owners in the United States in 1850. They didn't get a choice. They didn't get to vote for abolition. But they were forced to give up their slaves. And the 3 billion will make the other 3 billion give up their rights to birth. And the 3 billion that don't want to give them up, they're going to be just as unhappy as the people who had to give up their slaves. In fact, they went to war over it.
Right. So pandemic wars. Oh, of course, and natural disasters.
What kind of natural disaster can you imagine? Yellowstone blowing up and putting up a cloud, and then we have a 5-year winter? Would that do it? Close.
Well,
I think they have modeled a great eruption in Yellowstone. Would be
right.
big enough.
Yeah.
Okay, but we don't know when that's going to happen. I'm telling you that we need the solution before 2100, because we're going to be out of gas and we're going to not be able to feed people long before we get to 2100.
Mm.
And so people have to decide that they want to die of old age, even if it means no kids. That's the conversation over the back fence between the two grandmothers.
Did you say the values are extensions of our rationality, right? Not of our senses.
I'm saying for an AI, first off, I spent 30 years of my life trying to figure out whether or not I could grow infants that would grow up and say, oh, my parents are intellectual pygmies. This is the test that I gave everybody. And it turned out that Nobel laureates didn't do any better than 5th graders. And the question was, could I create a learning environment? Which is, if you go online, you can find my dissertation, Future Imaging Skills in Sustainable Societies. The question is, what cognitive abilities would they have to have?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, and this has already come up in this discussion, you can't learn by experience. You can't be halfway through an accident and say, I'll put my seatbelt on now. You're dead. You're dead. So
you can't learn by experience anymore. Never mind so the human. So basically, it's a changed human. He's not really.
Well, the grandmother isn't really changed, but they see a terrible future, and then they see this terrible social contract that says you can't have babies, and the grandmothers are beyond having babies, and they're not going to tell their kids not to have babies. They're changing the rules that nobody can have babies, and they're doing it consciously because going forward on the current path is so injurious and is so painful that they personally can see not having babies is a smaller injury than going forward and having everybody starve to death. We're really looking at 8 to 10 billion people starving to death between now and 2100. I mean, I don't understand why, when Bill and I go around about this and he says, well, what's happening? Look at how hard it is to get anything done in Ottawa. And I'm saying that's not the place you have to do the work. That's already a broken system. There is nothing in Washington, D.C. that's going to help us, no matter who we sent there. Because they got the truckers in the United States too. You got to get the trucker's grandmother. And she's got to pull the rug out from underneath the trucker. Okay. she's going to go ahead and pull the rug out from underneath the slave owners by making a nation that says can't have slaves. But it's 3 billion people who are going to make this decision on my model, or one person on, you know, the rich man's solution. Except it's not a, when the book was written, you had to be a rich man to create this virus that killed everybody. Now it's not. The ability to make a virus that will kill everybody is backyard tinker toys. You know, you'll be able to do it in the garage. And so all you need is one crazy person to do it, and it's done. I mean,
so you're not saying your model is based on that.
My model is based on what do we do if we don't want one crazy person to wipe us all out.
Okay. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Gabriel. If I could call on Virginia Hammond, we have one more question after that.
Okay.
For John Meyer.
Okay.
Well,
John and I are old friends. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it's certainly a very provocative talk. And I think you're right that it's going to be the grandmothers that are going to be working with the younger generations in developing solutions. I mean, I'm able in my head, I can hold the idea that, you know, the time has passed. I liked your metaphor and I've forgotten it. You know, I mean, we're already halfway over the cliff. And at the same time, I can hold in my head a certain level of optimism in that what I'm seeing going on is almost a renaissance of, because of all of the connectivity globally, people have so much more access to ideas. And what I'm seeing, I mean, I'm seeing it mostly right now in the arts, but I'm seeing just this flurry of very creative solutions in looking at a problem and pulling from a vast array of media and mediums and disciplines and coming up with extraordinarily creative solutions. And when I'm looking at the younger generation coming up, I am seeing an ability to think more systemically and collaboratively. And I think that is what is needed. What I do see somewhat echoed in your presentation is a dominator worldview. I mean, you are seeing that as through that lens, looking at the problem. And then it does seem to me that to some extent, that solution you're offering is also conscribed and proscribed and prescribed from that worldview, and that there's a fundamental shift in worldview happening. I mean, I know I date back to it's the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So I am seeing some evolution and shift in the way we look at how we solve problems. And that's where I'm holding, some optimism that we may figure out how to come up with a collaborative solution.
I think you should separate out, this is the engineer talking.
Okay.
I think you should separate out having young people develop better cognition and behave and personally behave better. That was my model for 30 years. I'm pretty sure it won't work. Okay. I have no hopes for any solution that results from a bunch of people, some fraction of the whole, personally behaving better. The system is so interconnected that if you had 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50% of the people not thinking well and acting normally, and 50% of the people thinking well and behaving well, that system, if you simulate that, you don't have a solution. The system will, the 50% will take you down. 20%, I mean, let's assume that everybody decided to have one kid per family, but 20% of the population decided to have 8 kids per family. Okay, that's not a viable system. If you really need to have 1 kid per family, which is what I worked on for 30 years, and I worked on it with the idea that I was going to create every single child was going to be brought up with a very sophisticated learning environment that kept, I called them temporal primitives, but I'm going to do this in language because it's easier to understand. When you're born, your ear hears 100 different sounds that the mouth can make. And by the time you're 6 months old, you're only listening to the 26 phonemes in the language of your parents. The other sounds, like a Swahili language click, you hear it, but it doesn't start the language processor. So my model was, how do I started describing what these temporal primitives are, this way of understanding future abstractions and then knowing what kind of behaviors to take. Those primitives are lost between 6 days and 6 months. And if you want the child to have them, you have to give them a learning environment that allows them to keep them rather than let them go, which means if it was language, you'd have to have them listening to all the languages in the world that speak that use all of the sound, all of the 100 phonemes. Okay, so when I went to Ford Foundation and tried to get them to fund this, they said, I had a very good friend and he was vice president of Ford at the time. My friend. And I got to eat in the fancy dining room and he said, "What's the story, Jack?" Well, I said, "It'll take me 50 years to define these, another 50 years to figure out how to get kids to learn them. And once I've got that, then I'm going to have a whole generation that's going to get these special learning environments. And then in another X number of years, like 125 years out there, then these kids will be in position to start making decisions and they're going to have to get rid of all this momentum. So it's a 275-year process before we got the world straightened out and working flying level." He says, "My board gives away money based on counting noses, like this kid in Biafra didn't starve, and you want them to count a nose that's 250 years in the future." He said, "I can't get you any money." That was, so you got to really pick your battles carefully. And I'm telling you, I think we're past the point where we can get the younger generation to be smarter and then behave better. Even if they do get smarter and even if they do behave better, until they put in a social contract that makes everybody behave better, themselves, their kids, everybody. And the better behaviors have to get to the end condition. Our end condition is 2100 when we're only going to be able to feed 600 million people as serfs. So we can't take a learning environment that takes 250 years to fix the problem that we're going to be facing in 2100. 2100 is right there. You and I are both dead. And our grandchildren are cannibals. And we let it happen because we wouldn't use it. We wouldn't bite the bullet and say, if we can't get to this very low birth rate, then the difference is people dying of starvation. And the birth rate is not a birth rate of number of kids per woman. It's 1 child for 140 women. That's how many permits we're going to be giving out. If the social contract is adopted tomorrow, 1 woman in 140 will be able to have a baby. And this works for the first 50 years. Now you still have this big population, but they're past postmenopausal. Okay, I hope I'm not raining on your parade, but it turns out that the 500,000 births per year, that cohort between 0 and 50 can have as many kids as they want for reasons that are obvious from the talk I gave. That once you get the birth cohort down to a sustainable population, your problem is not too many kids, it's too few. But we have to go through this horrible experience of only 1 woman in 140 having a baby for 50 years. I don't know who's going to vote for that, but I'm hoping it's one of the grandmothers. And she's voting for it because, as terrible as it sounds, it's less terrible than having 8 to 10 billion people starve to death.
Well, on that depressing note, we're going to have to call it quits because we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Virginia. And Jack, and I'll ask Dave Doherty if he could say something, please.
Well, I can't say that that was uplifting. It certainly presents a dark future. Bad on the one hand, worse on the other. And at any rate, I want to thank everybody who attended today and who sees this in future on the internet for paying attention to this. It certainly is our biggest problem. And I invite everybody, if you haven't been to our website, do visit us there. You can click on the registration for Stay Informed and get an email once a week that'll tell you what's new on the site. There are hundreds and hundreds of videos and articles there for your reading pleasure. If you choose to become a member, it is a registered charity. You will get a tax receipt, at least in Canada. We welcome members from outside Canada as well. Further, if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you're welcome to do that. And there are many videos there that you are welcome to see at your leisure. So thanks again, Jack. Not sure how soon we'll be able to get you back. Let us know if you've got new stuff within 6 to 12 months or so, and we'll see if we can do that.
I'd like to thank Art and Ed and Dave. They've been wonderful shepherds. They shepherd this project. And Sam Hopkins from the Ecosystem Study Group, I'd like to thank him because he forced me to do this about 2 weeks ago. And this video is his brainchild. Anybody who wants to see it can go to Jack Alpert Imaging a Sustainable Society on YouTube. You'll be able to find it. It's already up. It's private. But if you go to my website, skill.org, right on the front page under new videos, there'll be a link to this, to what you saw. Thank all of you.